think of trust is just, well, you and I have known each other for a long time, so we trust each other implicitly because we can predict one another's behavior. That's what I call predictive trust, right? Well, any two people that have known each other for a long period of time will have predictive trust because they can say, well, if she said this, this is probably how it's going to turn out. I can trust what's going to happen. Or, well, if we went to a meeting and we assign that to him, we can trust how he's going to behave because we've seen it a number of times. That's not what makes a team great. What makes a team great, if you know, is what we call vulnerability-based trust. Vulnerability-based trust is the kind of trust that comes about when human beings on a team can and will genuinely say things to one another like, I don't know the answer, I need help, I screwed that up, it was my fault. You're much smarter than I am. I wish I could become like you. I'd like to learn from you. Or I'm sorry, I was a jerk yesterday and I don't have any excuses. When human beings on a team can say those things genuinely, it changes the dynamic of a team completely. When you can get people to be truly buck naked emotionally, admit what they're not good at, admit their faults, and be totally honest and not pretend there's something different, it changes the dynamics of a team completely in any kind of organization. And the best way to remind ourselves of this is to think about times we've been on teams that didn't have that, or days and weeks and months when we didn't have that. And so I love to tell this story about a team I worked with. Jeff and I worked with them years ago, and it was a Silicon Valley startup, right? But it wasn't your typical garage band startup. It was a startup on steroids. This was a company that had handpicked all these rock star executives from Oracle and PeopleSoft and SAP, these technology companies. They had a bunch of money from venture capitalists right out of the gate. They had really good engineers that were lined up to work there. They had a great product idea. Everybody said this company was going to take over the industry, IPO, make a big splash in the market. Everybody said this was going to be this great company, but they were struggling and they didn't know why, so they called us to work with them because somebody on their team knew our company. So, rather than just do a 2-day offsite, they were located not very far from us. So we went and observed a staff meeting beforehand. We don't usually do that, but we said, let's go watch them in a staff meeting. And we saw two really interesting things there. One, they were getting their butts kicked by companies that were not near as smart as they were. So they're like, well, hey, these companies aren't as smart. That's how unhealthy they were. They were dysfunctional. But we also noticed this really interesting dynamic on the team. You see, there was this one woman on the team. It doesn't matter that she was a woman, she just was. And she was in charge of marketing. It doesn't matter, but she just was. So this woman in charge of marketing on the team, there was really interesting. They would get into a discussion about the market. They'd say, what are we going to do about this competitor? This one competitor's beating us. What are we going to do to fight against them? And they would be debating back and forth, and she wouldn't say anything. And finally, she'd weigh in, and she'd say, this is what we did when we were at SAP. So that's what I think we should do. And the room would go totally silent. There would be this awkward pause until somebody changed the subject and they went on to something else. So then they'd be debating some other issue, and then she'd weigh in and say, here's what I think we should do, and it would go silent again. Total momentum killer. After the meeting, I went to one of the people on the team, and I said, what's going on? How come nobody ever says anything when she talks? And he said, you know why? Because we've learned in the first few months of working with her that every time she says something, that if we disagree with her or have a different perspective, she never admits she might be wrong. She never acknowledges we might have a good answer. She always digs her heels in. She never changes her mind. So we finally decided, why bother? Which we thought was kind of interesting, right? So a couple weeks later, we went and had an offsite with this team. And it was a 2-day offsite. And the first morning of the offsite, kind of like today, we went through all this stuff. And we talked about vulnerability-based trust. And we talked about all the other things. And we talked about strategy and competitive analysis and all that stuff. And then at the end of that first day, we went to dinner at an Italian restaurant. I remember it well. It was in Santa Cruz. They had bocce ball in the back. There's this cool little restaurant there. Not that that matters, but I remembered it, so I said it. So anyway, and at the end of dinner, where we had wine. By the way, wine, as you know, I found out last night, is the great elixir of truth on many teams. This woman had a few too many glasses of wine. And she stood up at the end of dinner. Jeff was there. You can ask him. It's a true story. She stood up at the end of dinner, raised her glass like for a toast, and said, hey, you guys, I just want you to know I've been married for 10 years now, and I've just barely learned to trust my husband this year. And so I'm not going to be trusting you guys anytime soon, if ever. Cheers. And we were like, cheers. All right. And after the meeting, I walked outside with the CEO, also a woman, and I said to her, we both agreed, this is the problem. This woman has some deep issue around trust that probably dates back to her childhood. I mean, it was deep. And as much as we wanted to go get Dr. Phil and the local priest or minister and this woman's mama in for some deep tissue therapy, they had a company to run, so we couldn't do that. But we really tried to work with this woman to get her to open up and to be more vulnerable. And it was very clear she wasn't going to do that. So finally, after far too long, the CEO would say it took her far too long, she finally managed her off the team and out of the company. And do you know the dynamics of that team changed so much? At the very next meeting, we could see it was like a completely different team. You would have thought we had swapped out every member of the team for a new one because it was a completely different team because one single person who couldn't be vulnerable was gone. See, one person who can't be vulnerable can infect a team.